Living in a small town, you get used to the same faces, the same routines. For the past year, my life had settled into a familiar rhythm, working in the city during the week, then driving back home to Sarah on the weekends. I was proud of the life we were building, even if it meant spending most of my time away from her. But lately, something didn't sit right with me. Every Friday, I'd come home, eager to see Sarah, but the excitement wasn't always mutual. It began with small things, missed calls, shorter conversations, and the way she always seemed distracted. At first, I tried to let it go, chalking it up to stress or the routine of married life, but once that doubt crept in, it was hard to ignore. One evening, after a long week, I decided to unwind with a few beers. My neighbor, Tim, was around, and he joined me. We weren't exactly close, but he was good company when you needed someone to chat with. That night, though, he seemed off. He wasn't his usual easygoing self. As we talked, I noticed how he kept bringing up Sarah in a way that made me uneasy. He mentioned seeing her around the neighborhood, how she'd been keeping busy while I was away. The way he said it, like he knew something I didn't, made my stomach turn. "You ever wonder what she's up to when you're gone?" Tim asked casually, but the question hit me like a ton of bricks. I laughed it off, trying to stay cool, but inside, I felt something gnawing at me. Fear, maybe? Doubt? I wasn't sure, but it stuck with me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But Tim wasn't finished. "You know, women get lonely," he continued, swirling his drink, "especially when their husbands are away so much." That feeling of unease came back, stronger this time. Was he hinting at something? I looked at him, trying to read his expression, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Sarah's a good woman," I said, more to convince myself than him. "We've been through a lot together." Tim just nodded, a strange look on his face. "Yeah, she is. Just keep an eye out, okay? Sometimes things aren't what they seem." I didn't know what to say. The uneasiness that had been building in me all week was now a full-blown storm. I finished my drink and made some excuse to leave. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if Tim knew more than he was letting on. When I got home, Sarah was already in bed, the house quiet and still. I stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The woman I loved was right there, yet she felt so distant, so unreachable. The next day, I tried to shake off the conversation with Tim, but the doubt had already taken hold. Little things started to get under my skin, like how Sarah didn't seem as excited to see me anymore, or how she always had plans with her friends whenever I was home. When I asked her about it, she'd brush it off, saying she just wanted to stay busy. But her answers didn't feel right. I started paying more attention, noticing things I hadn't before, like how she'd linger on her phone after getting a message, or how she'd suddenly get defensive when I asked her about her day. There were more late nights out with her friends, more stories that didn't quite add up. But every time I brought it up, she'd laugh it off, calling me paranoid. Part of me wanted to trust her, to believe that it was all in my head. But the other part, the one that kept getting louder, couldn't ignore what was right in front of me. I found myself second-guessing everything, questioning every little thing she said or did. The love we'd built over the years now felt fragile, like it could fall apart at any moment. The worst part was, I didn't know how to talk to her about it without sounding like I didn't trust her. How do you ask the person you love if they're seeing someone else? How do you voice that kind of suspicion without shattering everything? That weekend, we barely spoke. The tension between us was thick, but neither of us acknowledged it. I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I drove back to the city on Monday, my mind was a mess. I tried to focus on work, on anything but the growing distance between us. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that things were slipping out of control. I didn't want to believe that Sarah could be unfaithful. We'd been through so much together, ups and downs, highs and lows. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore the signs. The doubt was there, gnawing at me, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. That whole week, I was distracted, going through the motions at work while my mind was miles away, back home with Sarah. I kept replaying my conversations with Tim, looking for clues, trying to figure out what he was really saying. Was he just drunk and talking nonsense, or was there something more to it? By the time Friday rolled around again, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. But I knew I had to go home and face whatever was happening, even if I wasn't ready for it. As I made the drive back, my heart was heavy, filled with a dread I couldn't shake. When I walked through the door that evening, Sarah greeted me with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something not right, something I couldn't quite place. I wanted to ask her straight out if something was going on, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I couldn't sleep. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to make everything okay again. But I was afraid of what I might find if I looked too closely, if I pushed too hard. So I stayed quiet, pretending that everything was fine, even though I knew it wasn't. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer we could keep up this charade. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. The next week was a blur. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to Sarah and the nagging feeling that something was seriously wrong. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. The late nights, the vague explanations, Tim's insinuations, they all started to form a picture I didn't want to see. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was a mess. I'd spent the entire drive home rehearsing how I was going to talk to Sarah, but when I walked through the door, all those words evaporated. She greeted me with the same forced smile, and once again, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Saturday morning, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know the truth, one way or another. Sarah had gone out early to run some errands, and as I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee, I realized this was my chance to do some digging. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. I started with her phone. She usually kept it with her, but today she'd left it on the counter. I knew her passcode, just another small, seemingly innocent detail that now felt like it carried so much weight. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, my heart pounding in my chest. There wasn't anything obvious at first, no incriminating messages or photos. But as I scrolled through her texts, I noticed something odd. A few conversations with someone saved under a generic name, like Jess from work. The messages were short, nothing overtly suspicious, but they had a weird tone to them. Too friendly, too casual for a work colleague. My gut told me this wasn't just a friend. I dug deeper, looking at her call history, her social media. Everything seemed normal, but that only made me more uneasy. It was like she was being too careful, too good at covering her tracks. It made me wonder how long this had been going on, how much she'd been hiding from me. Just as I was about to put the phone down, something caught my eye, a notification from a calendar app. It was a reminder for later that day. Meeting. The location was a local coffee shop. Nothing unusual, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Sarah had never mentioned any meeting. I decided to follow her. It felt like I was crossing a line, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would finally reveal the truth I needed. That afternoon, I waited until she left the house. Then I grabbed my keys and followed her, keeping a safe distance. I felt like a spy in some bad movie, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what she was up to. She drove to the coffee shop, just like the notification had said. I parked a little ways down the street and watched as she got out of the car. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to stop this before it went too far. But I couldn't. I was in too deep. As I watched, a familiar figure approached her. It was Tim. They greeted each other with a hug, and I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't just a friendly hug. It was too close, too intimate. They stood there for a moment, talking, laughing, completely at ease. It was like I didn't even exist. I couldn't watch anymore. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up right there in the car. I wanted to burst out, to confront them both, but something held me back. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was the realization that everything Tim had hinted at was true. My worst fears were confirmed right there in broad daylight with the people I thought I could trust the most. After what felt like an eternity, they went inside the coffee shop, and I finally let out the breath I didn't realize I was holding. I sat there, staring at the entrance, trying to process what I'd just seen. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, disbelief. When they finally left the coffee shop, I was still sitting there, numb. They didn't notice me, too caught up in their own world to care. I watched as they walked to their cars, lingering for a moment before going their separate ways. Sarah looked happy, relaxed, like she hadn't a care in the world. As I drove home, the reality of what I'd seen started to sink in. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? Why Tim, of all people? Had she ever loved me, or was it all a lie? I wanted answers, but I was terrified of what they might be. Back at the house, I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of it all. The betrayal cut deep, but so did the realization that I'd been so blind, so trusting. I kept replaying our last few months together, looking for signs I'd missed, moments where I should have seen the truth but didn't. By the time Sarah came home, I was drained. She walked in, acting like everything was normal, like she hadn't just spent the afternoon with another man. It made me furious, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to keep it together, to confront her when I had a clear head, not when I was caught up in my emotions. We had dinner together, making small talk, but I could barely focus on what she was saying. All I could think about was the image of her and Tim together, the way they'd looked at each other, the way they'd laughed. It was like a knife twisting in my gut. That night, as we lay in bed, the distance between us felt like an ocean. I turned away from her, unable to bear the thought of touching her, of pretending everything was okay. She didn't say anything, didn't ask why I was so quiet. Maybe she sensed that something was wrong, or maybe she was too wrapped up in her own world to notice. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept going over everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. The doubt was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. My marriage was over, whether I wanted to admit it or not. The question now was, how was I going to end it? The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep living in this lie, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, but I also knew I needed to confront Sarah, to hear her side, even if it was just to confirm what I already knew. As she got ready for the day, I watched her, trying to muster the courage to say what I needed to say. It felt like the calm before the storm, and I knew that once I opened my mouth, there would be no going back. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Sarah, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely steady. She turned to look at me, surprise flickering in her eyes. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know about you and Tim." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. She didn't say anything, just stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "I saw you yesterday," I continued, forcing the words out. "At the coffee shop. I know what's been going on." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she sank down onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, her words muffled. "I didn't want it to happen, but it did. I'm so sorry." Hearing her admit it, the last bit of hope I'd been clinging to crumbled. There was no denying it now, no pretending that things could ever go back to the way they were. I wanted to scream, to yell, to demand why she had done this to us. But all I could do was stand there, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I'd thought I knew, everything we'd built together, was gone. And there was no getting it back. The moment those words left her lips, a cold emptiness settled inside me. I had braced myself for this, prepared myself for the truth, but nothing could have readied me for the weight of hearing her admit it. She was cheating. With Tim. The realization hit me all over again, like a punch to the gut. Sarah just sat there on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, mumbling apologies that felt like they were coming from miles away. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I thought I knew. But she wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. Nothing was. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and suffocating. I wanted to yell, to ask why she did this, how she could throw away everything we had, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all I could think about was how broken everything felt. "You're sorry?" I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. It sounded hollow, even to me. She nodded, still not looking up, and that was it. That was all she had to say. No explanation, no attempt to justify it, just an empty apology. I couldn't believe it. After everything we'd been through, after all the years we'd spent together, it all came down to this. Why, Sarah? I asked, my voice cracking despite my effort to stay composed. Why him? Why now? She finally looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I don't know, she whispered, shaking her head. It just happened. I was lonely, you were always gone, and Tim was there. I never meant for it to go this far. That's it? I said, feeling a surge of anger rise in me. I'm gone a few days a week, and that's enough to justify this? She flinched at the harshness of my tone, but I didn't care. I was done trying to be understanding, done trying to make sense of her actions. The woman I loved had betrayed me, and no excuse would ever be good enough. I'm not justifying it, she said, her voice trembling. I know I messed up, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't know what I was thinking. Her words hung in the air, but they did nothing to soothe the storm inside me. I felt like I was in free fall. Everything I had believed in, everything I had worked for, crumbling to dust. This was the woman I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with, the woman I thought I could trust more than anyone. And now, here we were, our marriage reduced to this painful, ugly truth. I turned away from her, pacing the room, trying to think clearly. But all I could see was the image of her with Tim, laughing and smiling like I didn't even exist. It was like a poison spreading through my veins, making it impossible to think straight. We're done, I said finally, my voice hardening as the reality of the situation set in. There's no coming back from this, Sarah. You destroyed us. She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She just nodded, her face crumpling as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. A part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to take away her pain like I always had. But I couldn't. Not this time. I'll pack some things, I said, my voice cold and detached. I'm leaving. No, please don't go, she pleaded, standing up and reaching for me. We can talk about this. We can try to fix it. But I was already pulling away. There's nothing left to fix, I said, not bothering to hide the bitterness in my voice. You made your choice, Sarah. Now I'm making mine. She froze, her hand hovering in the air as if she didn't know what to do with it. I didn't give her a chance to respond. I walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and into the spare room where I kept a few things. I grabbed a duffel bag and started throwing in clothes, anything I could get my hands on. I didn't care what I took. I just needed to get out of there. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching me with a look of despair on her face. She didn't try to stop me again, and for that, I was grateful. The last thing I wanted was a scene, more drama, more lies. I was done with it all. As I zipped up the bag, I paused for a moment, looking around the room. This had been our home, our life together. But now it felt foreign, like I didn't belong here anymore. The walls that had once held so many memories now felt like a cage, suffocating me. I walked past her without a word, heading for the front door. But just as I reached for the handle, she spoke again, her voice trembling with desperation. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face her, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. We'll figure it out, I said, my tone distant. But not together. Not anymore. With that, I opened the door and stepped outside, into the crisp evening air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every step I took away from that house, away from her, felt like a piece of my soul was being ripped out, but I knew I had to keep going. I got in my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't be there anymore, couldn't be with her, not after what she had done. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, much like the future I now faced. I thought about all the plans we'd made, all the dreams we'd shared, and how quickly they had all turned to ash. I felt like I was in mourning, grieving not just the loss of my marriage, but the loss of the life I thought I had. For a long time, I just drove, the silence in the car punctuated only by the occasional beep of my phone as messages and missed calls came through. I didn't need to look to know they were from Sarah, but I didn't have the strength to read them, much less respond. Eventually, I found myself at a small roadside motel. I pulled in, parked, and sat there for a moment, staring at the neon sign flickering in the night. This was it, my new reality. A cheap motel room, a duffel bag of clothes, and a heart full of pain. I checked in, got a room, and collapsed onto the bed, feeling like I had been drained of everything. I was numb, too exhausted to think, too broken to care. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had ended up here. How had everything gone so wrong? How had the woman I loved become the source of so much pain? But there were no answers, just an endless void of silence and darkness. I had lost everything: my marriage, my home, my sense of self, and all I was left with was the bitter taste of betrayal and the cold, hard truth that the life I had known was gone forever. Eventually, sleep took me, pulling me down into a restless oblivion. But even in sleep, there was no escape. My dreams were haunted by images of Sarah and Tim, by the echoes of a love that had once been so strong, but was now shattered beyond repair. When I woke up the next morning, it was with the cold, stark realization that this wasn't just a bad dream, it was my life now. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken. I had to move forward, to pick up the pieces of what was left and try to rebuild. But as I lay there in that dingy motel room, I couldn't help but wonder how I was supposed to do that. How do you start over when the person you trusted most in the world has betrayed you? How do you move on when everything you believed in has been torn apart?